So I've kind of been obsessing about Cinderella lately, with Bridgerton season 4 coming out in January, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is going to be a Cinderella retelling. I've just been fascinated by this concept of Cinderella constantly being retold, but to the point where we just accept it. We tell Cinderella so much that it's almost not a retelling anymore. It's sort of become its own just story archetype or its own story trope. Because if you think about Bridgerton, when we had season 1, it's like, yeah, it's like fake dating. Cool, that's a common trope. We had season 2, it's like, this is enemies to lovers. Cool, that's a common trope. We got season 3, which was like friends to lovers. Yeah, good. Then we get season 4 and it's like, this is Cinderella. And we're all just like, yeah, cool, good. As if that's a common story trope, when it's so many aspects, specific aspects of a story that's like retold time and time again, but we're not sick of it. I find that really interesting. So I decided to rewatch a bunch of Cinderella movies. I even went and read the original Grimm fairy tale, and I went down a bit of a Cinderella rabbit hole. So I'm going to brain dump all of that on you today. So let's do it. So to kick things off in this sort of Cinderella deep dive, I thought I'm going to read the original fairy tale because from what I've heard, it's absolutely nothing like what our modern interpretation of Cinderella is, with like a fairy godmother in pumpkins and glass slippers and stuff. So I read the original fairy tale, or what I've always considered to be the original fairy tale of Cinderella, which was Aschenputtel, or Aschenputtel, I don't know, I don't speak German, by the Grimm brothers. So I read that, crazy story, not really like our modern Cinderella. The dad doesn't die, he's just a dick along with the mother and stepsisters. There is no fairy godmother or magic, it's like the birds who help her out. She goes and dances with the prince multiple nights in a row. It's not just one ball. The glass slipper isn't glass, it's gold. And the stepsisters like mutilate their own feet and cut off their toes and stuff to try and fit their foot into the slipper. Yeah, kind of wild. But I read this thinking it's the original fairy tale, and I don't know why I've always assumed this. I just thought it was well-known fact. I don't know if it's because of the beginning of the movie Ever After, but I was really, really mistaken that this was the original Cinderella. In fact, this Grimm fairy tale, which was written in 1812, is probably one of the more modern retellings of Cinderella, which in itself kind of blew my mind because, I don't know, when you think classic fairy tale, I've always just sort of thought it's probably written by the Brothers Grimm or maybe by Hans Christian Andersen, and they're always a bit darker than the current retellings. But the Brothers Grimm, it's like, yeah, it's Snow White, it's Rapunzel, it's Cinderella, it's Little Red Riding Hood, it's Rumpelstiltskin. And so, yeah, I've just always assumed that Cinderella came from the Brothers Grimm. But turns out that Cinderella is actually one of the sort of oldest retold stories in like human history. And the Grimm brothers version that was 1812, the more modern version of Cinderella, like with the magic and the pumpkins and the glass slipper, is actually from 1697 and was written by Charles Perrault, who was a French author, and he wrote the sort of more modern version of Cinderella over 100 years before the Brothers Grimm wrote the like not very Cinderella version of it, which again I found fascinating. But if you go back even further than that, apparently the first recorded telling of Cinderella, not by the name Cinderella but of the sort of story archetype, is first recorded in the 1st century in ancient Greece. And it's sort of like a lot of mythological creatures. If you look into the history of every different culture around the world, they have their own version of this mythological creature or certain stories. Basically every ancient culture around the world has its own version of Cinderella. Like, they've all got their own versions of vampires and mermaids. They've all got their own version of Cinderella. That's crazy. That's crazy. And by the sort of story archetype of Cinderella, obviously they're going to massively change culture to culture and throughout time. But like the oldest recorded story of Cinderella, the Greek one, is about like this slave girl who an eagle takes her sandal to like the king, and then the king searches for the girl whose sandal it is and then marries her. Like, that's pretty Cinderella, right? And every retelling of this story, like I say, there's different aspects, but it's always about a mistreated girl who usually loses an item, and more often than not, it is a shoe. And she'll go through some sort of transformation, whether that's with magic or without magic. And by the end, she's sort of transformed and she goes from like rags to riches and usually marries royalty. I find this crazy because that's such a specific story. And most of the time as well, most of the time she does have a stepmother and two stepsisters. What do you mean? How has that story been told in every culture? Like, basically as long as we have recorded human history of storytelling. In like human recorded history of storytelling, every ancient culture has its own version of Cinderella. That blew my mind. That blew my mind. And I said the first instance of sort of, I guess, the most modern version of Cinderella with the glass slipper, pumpkin and the fairy godmother came about in 1697 in France. But the earliest recorded story of Cinderella having magic was a Chinese story that was written in 850 AD. Madness. So when I sort of went on this rabbit hole and discovered all this, it did suddenly make a bit more sense to me. Why we are okay with retelling Cinderella so much. Like, I almost feel like Cinderella must be hardwired into us as humans because the story's been told for so long in like every culture throughout human history. Like, Cinderella is pretty much sort of ingrained in us, I guess, which is maybe why it can just be retold so much and we don't necessarily consider it tired or old, because it's not a story that keeps getting retold. It is in itself like a story baseline construct. Madness. So, history lesson aside, I guess all of that is to say, if we keep retelling Cinderella over and over again throughout human history and we're all okay with that, why is that? There must be something about Cinderella that is completely timeless. And so I started to think about this and I thought, I guess when you get down to the bare bones of Cinderella, like remove all the sort of fairy godmother and pumpkins and glass slipper, like the baseline story of Cinderella, the bit that stays the same no matter the sort of version or retelling, I guess it's just quite a typical story narrative of just being uplifted and most of the time like rags to riches with love as a through line. Because in Cinderella, obviously most versions will start where she's like quite literally almost abused, like she's been made to be a servant. But even in some modern versions, like when I think of like the Hilary Duff Cinderella story, she's obviously not a servant, she is still, because it's modern day where people don't have servants, but she is lesser than the rest of her family and not given opportunities and is like the underdog. So even if it's not quite literal, a girl sleeping in the ashes of the fire to the point where she's bullied and called Cinderella, she is still probably going to be the underdog and looked down on and not taken seriously, bullied, whatever it is. And she's going to go through a journey of transformation, find love along the way, and by the end, she'll have come out on top. It's sort of just like underdog rags to riches, maybe all lead back to Cinderella. And although the story's always been around, I think Cinderella is much more mainstream now because of Disney and because of film. And with that, we've sort of globally accepted the same version, which I do think has come from Disney, which in turn is most like the French version of Cinderella. I would say we probably are a bit sick of seeing Cinderella when it's like Cinderella. You see the name Cinderella. This is how I think we all felt when the Camila Cabello one came out. Because it was like pure Cinderella. It was like the Disney French version of it. But if you go to the bare bones of what I said Cinderella is, basically rags to riches underdog, but you just keep in a few key elements like the stepmother and the stepsisters, the dead dad, and a love story, then I feel like you can sort of do whatever you want with the transformation part in the middle of it. And I think that's maybe why Cinderella is still quite fresh and it can be retold a lot, because there is a lot you can play with within the transformation rags to riches aspect of the story. And obviously since Disney in the 1950s and with just like film in general and like wider access to media as humans. Cinderella, I think, is being retold on a much greater scale and is being modernised a lot quicker. But I actually really like that about Cinderella. I love that we're modernising it and putting it in different settings and in different scenarios, because modern retellings of Cinderella, I think, are doing a lot to fix the original issues of the sort of kiddie fairy tale, which is usually that they fix the insta-love, love at first sight, I met you 5 minutes ago, but now I'm going to marry you aspect of it. And it focuses a lot more on internal journey as well. And we get a lot more like adventure and build up. Like, I actually watched the 1950s version for the first time since I was like a little kid. And the majority of that movie is her doing housework or the cat chasing the mice. There's not really much story with going to the ball and the prince and stuff. So I do love that modern versions of the story have like stretched out the transformation and added a lot more depth to that part of the story. And the version of Cinderella that I think does this best and is currently, I think, the best told Cinderella story is Ever After. So I grew up on Ever After. I had it on VHS when I was a kid, and I used to just watch it on repeat, like I knew it word for word, frame by frame. But I hadn't watched Ever After in a really long time. Honestly, maybe since I'd watched it on VHS. Like, I think at least 15 years. And I'd always been a bit hesitant to rewatch it because I had such a high expectation for it. Like, my memory of it was that it was the best film ever. So I think I was a bit scared to rewatch it in case it wasn't as good as I remembered. But I did rewatch it and it was as good as I remembered. It's such a good film. It's such a good Cinderella retelling. And I think Ever After is so good because they perfectly modernised Cinderella. And obviously I say that, the movie's now like 27 years old and it's set in the 16th century. And yet I think it's one of the best modern versions of Cinderella, if you can call it modern for those reasons. So let's talk about why. So with Ever After, I think they modernised the character of Cinderella. In Ever After, she's called Danielle, but they modernise her so well because she reflects our current values of femininity and female empowerment, but like in a very subtle, gentle way. There are Cinderellas where they've tried to modernise Cinderella so much, like the girl bossification of Cinderella, to the point where it's cringy and it doesn't fit with the rest of the story anymore. Like the Camila Cabello one. I think they tried to girl boss Cinderella way too much to the point where it was just like, this doesn't even work anymore. But in Ever After, it's done so well. Like, there's no magic in Ever After. There's no fairy godmother. Well, the fairy godmother's Leonardo da Vinci.
Then I shall have to make you wings.
But there's no magic to save Danielle, Cinderella. It's her own self-will. She's headstrong, she's determined. She saves herself, and love helps her in her journey and coincides with her journey. But the prince is not what saves Danielle, Cinderella. She saves herself. She dresses up as nobility to go and save her friend from being sold overseas. At the end, when she herself is sold to this weird, rapey man, she gets herself out of it. She saves herself. The prince doesn't need to come in and save her. She's already freed herself. And I think that is the main problem with the original fairy tale, is it was the prince in like Disney. The only reason he likes Cinderella is like her beauty. Like lust at first sight, I'm going to marry her. That doesn't work, I think, with modern audiences that are over the age of 6. So I think that's what Ever After does really well as well, is the prince falls for Danielle because of her intelligence, her kindness, her strength, her views, the fact that she like calls him out on his maybe questionable political and moral beliefs that she doesn't agree with. And it develops that relationship in a real way, not just in a love at first sight way. And I think Bridgerton is going to do this potentially the best out of modern retellings. And when I say modern retellings, I'm mainly referring to film here because it's the easiest for us to talk about. But there are so many book retellings of Cinderella recently. Can anyone remember that cyborg one, Cinder? Yeah, Bridgerton, I think, is going to do the love story, possibly the best, almost just for the sheer fact that it's going to be like 8 episodes and not like a 2-hour movie. Although in Bridgerton, it is somewhat lust at first sight at the ball. So it'll be interesting to see how they play with that. But in general, over the course of those 8 episodes, we will get a lot more development than I think we've ever seen in a Cinderella romance. So I think that'll be really cool. In Ever After as well, there's no magic, like I said. There's no magical system. It is based sort of in realism. But it still has that like magical feeling. I think because it is set in the 16th century and the costumes are amazing, and when she comes in with these big wings at the ball. So I don't think Cinderella has to have magic in order to feel that fairy tale magic about it. In Bridgerton, I think it'll be really similar to Ever After as well. There'll be no magic system, but it's set in the Regency era, and with Bridgerton, all their amazing set dressings, all the amazing costumes, I do think, or I hope, it will still have that magic fairy tale feeling about it, because I do think the show in general has that feeling about it. In the old school Cinderellas, like Disney, we're talking like their identity issue is like, I don't know you unless this shoe fits you. Or even in like a Cinderella story, I find the whole identity issue a bit crazy, because like, how do you not know that's Hilary Duff? You were literally just having a conversation with her. She looks exactly the same, only she's got a flimsy mask on. Whereas in Ever After, I think they really fix the identity issue, because it's not that he doesn't recognise her in different situations. It's that she is pretending to be nobility for a real purpose, and that's the scenario in which they meet. And so it's more like a story of mistaken identity than the person's so dumb that they can't remember the identity. So I think Ever After fixes the identity problem really well. My thoughts on Bridgerton, I'm really interested to see how they're going to portray this, because Bridgerton is quite unique, because Benedict is going to meet and know both versions of Sophie, of Cinderella. He's going to know her as nobility and as the servant, as the maid. This kind of happens in Ever After. The first time they meet, she is a servant lobbing apples at him, and then they meet when she's dressed as nobility, and he doesn't put the 2 and 2 together until the end when he finds out she's a servant.
The apple. That was you?
A similar thing is going to happen, I guess, in Bridgerton, but it's going to be quite unique in the sense that Benedict, our prince, falls for both versions of Sophie, of Cinderella. Like in Ever After, he does meet for both versions of Danielle, but he doesn't fall for the servant. They barely meet. Whereas Benedict's going to be sort of simultaneously pining for the 2 different versions of Cinderella. And I feel like that's a really unique spin on it that will be cool. I can't wait to see how they handle Benedict yearning simultaneously for both versions of Cinderella. I think that'll be a really cool thing to see. Another common thing with Cinderella, I think because it comes from a kid's fairy tale and it was like made mainstream by Disney, it's a very kid-friendly PG story. Like even Ever After, it's all very PG and kid-friendly. And I feel like Bridgerton is one of the first on screen. There's a lot of like spicy versions of Cinderella, I think, in books, but on screen, I think this might be one of the biggest mainstream versions of Cinderella that's going to be horny. And a lot of things seem to change in Cinderella, like sometimes there's not a glass slipper. We do have a slipper in Ever After. In Bridgerton, it's a glove that she leaves behind. But one thing that seems to always come about in pretty much every Cinderella story is the stepmother and 2 stepsisters, which is so specific that I find it really interesting that is an aspect of the Cinderella story that keeps coming back. Because, yeah, it's just really, really specific. Something that I love that Ever After does, and that Bridgerton will do, given that it stays true to the book, is in a lot of versions of Cinderella, the 2 stepsisters are both as evil as their mother and as cruel as their mother. In Ever After and in An Offer from a Gentleman, one of the stepsisters is actually a friend to Cinderella and is kind, and while is loved by their mother, there's one sister that is like the golden child. That other sister is like the spare, and that spare sister does care for Cinderella and consider her a sister. They do that in Ever After, and I love it. And like I say, given that they do the same thing in the book on the TV for Bridgerton, that is also the case in Bridgerton. So I think that's a way to humanise it a bit more, because I kind of hate it when villains are just pure villains and that's it. I really love Angelica Houston in in Ever After as well, because although she is very much cruel and evil, and you don't feel sorry for her, and I don't think they overly humanise her, there is a bit more understanding behind it. Like, you understand it's this all or nothing social climbing, and it's jealousy, and it's putting herself above everyone else, but using her daughters as a means to bring up herself. Like, she wants her daughters to marry a prince, but it's not for their benefit, it's sort of for her own. I'll be really interested to see how they handle the stepmother in Bridgerton, whether they give her any sort of nuance and like explanation behind her motives, because I do actually feel like Bridgerton is really good at this. They do it, I think they did it really well with Cressida in season 3 of Bridgerton. She wasn't just straight up a villain, they did give a bit more backstory as to why this villainous behaviour is her motive, like what is she running from, that this is why she makes these choices. I'm really hoping they do that with the stepmother in Bridgerton, but we'll have to wait and see for that. But yeah, like I say, especially in Ever After, a big part of why the stepmother is the villain and is so cruel is social climbing. And I think as well that's why Cinderella is quite timeless, because it always focuses on like class and hierarchy of society, and those things, as long as we live in like a capitalist society, are always going to be prevalent and always going to be stories that keep getting retold. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this class debate in Bridgerton, because I think the Regency era it's set in is going to be really, really, really juicy. Like in Ever After and in most stories of Cinderella is nobility. It's just that she's been made to be a servant, but she is of noble birth. Whereas in Bridgerton, her dad is nobility, but her mother was not. Like, she's a bastard. She's not noble by birth. So there is definitely more of like class wars and that sort of narrative going to play out in Bridgerton. And I think that's going to be one of the best parts. And they have addressed class in Bridgerton before, like with the Eloise-Theo relationship and with the Mondridges inheriting title. But it's going to be on such like a bigger level, I think, in the new season of Bridgerton. I feel like it's going to be a bit more like Downton Abbey. Throughout Bridgerton, really, we've just been looking at the Bridgertons, the nobility in the household, and you don't really see the servants unless they're announcing something. In the next season of Bridgerton, we're going to see sort of behind that curtain, I guess, and we're going to go more into this analysing class and social hierarchy. I'm excited to see that because I think it'll add a lot of depth to the show and make it just a bit more juicy, and it's going to make the forbidden nature of their relationship just, I think, really sweet and succulent. So yeah, I'm really excited for the next season of Bridgerton. If you couldn't tell, I'm really looking forward to another Cinderella story, but I think it'll be very unique, and I think it's going to be really satisfying because it's going to be so much more slow burn and told over like 8 hours as opposed to 2, and I think that'll add so much depth to the story. If you're not already subscribed, then hit subscribe if you want to talk about this more, because I'm sure when Bridgerton drops in January, I will be making videos about it. If you want to talk more about Bridgerton, I did also do this video where I talk about all of the books, and yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Please like, hype, comment, subscribe, etc, 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 and I'll see you next time. Okay, love you, bye.